November 4, 2010. A day that started like any other for 440 passengers aboard Qantas Airways Flight 32, a massive Airbus A380. But little did they know, by the time they reached their cruising altitude, they'd be fighting for their lives in a battle against time and technology. This wasn't just any flight, this was one of the world's most advanced aircraft, a flying fortress in the sky. And what happened next would shake even the most experienced pilots to their core. This is the incredible story of one of the most harrowing emergency landings in aviation history. The calm before the storm. It was 9:56 a.m. when Captain Richard D. Krepney, a seasoned veteran with over 15,000 hours in the air, and First Officer Matt Hicks, with over 11,000 flight hours, took to the skies over Singapore and the Qantas Airbus A380. Everything was normal at first. The aircraft, just 2 years old, was in perfect condition. With nearly 500 souls on board, the plan was simple: climb to 7,000 feet, set the autopilot, and cruise across the ocean. But suddenly, the unimaginable happened. 2 deafening bangs. The aircraft shuddered. Engine number 2 on the left side had exploded. And it wasn't just an engine failure. What followed would leave the crew scrambling to save the lives of everyone on board. The explosive aftermath shrapnel from the explosion blasted through the wing and fuselage, tearing through hundreds of wires, cutting off vital systems, and causing jet fuel to spill out from under the wing, dangerously close to the engine. Fuel was pouring out. The aircraft was in danger of catching fire. But worse, the damage was more extensive than anyone had imagined. The crew's instruments began flashing with warning messages, and it was clear this was no ordinary engine failure. The crew's dial main, the cockpit, the pilots were facing a nightmare. They had no idea how severe the damage was. Hundreds of systems were malfunctioning. Some of the aircraft's remaining engines were in degraded mode, meaning the crew had limited information about their performance. They didn't know how long the plane would stay in the air, or if they'd even make it back to Singapore. One of the first signs of the scale of the disaster was the failure of the fire suppression system. The crew tried repeatedly to extinguish the engine fire, but they received no confirmation that it worked. Meanwhile, the engine was still leaking fuel, and the damage to the aircraft's electrical and hydraulic systems was mounting. The media panic and public perception. Meanwhile, back on the ground, residents of Batam, a nearby island, were hearing the thundering sound of debris falling from the sky. Parts of the engine were crashing through rooftops, and word quickly spread that a Qantas plane had suffered a catastrophic failure. The news spread like wildfire, and Qantas' stock price began to plummet. But the crew? They had no idea what was going on outside. They were too focused on surviving the nightmare in the sky. The crew's response to the crisis. Back in the cockpit, the pilots were in constant communication with air traffic control, but there was no easy answer. With the crippled aircraft and dozens of warning messages flashing across the screen, they had to make a life or death decision: attempt to return to Singapore immediately, or stay in the air to assess the damage and troubleshoot. After agonizing over the decision, Captain D. Krepney chose to stay in the air a little longer. They needed to figure out what was really happening before they attempted a landing. The nightmare continues. But things weren't getting better. They were losing hydraulic pressure, which powered the plane's flight controls. They were flying with one hand tied behind their back. The slats on the wings, vital for slowing down during landing, were no longer working. And with fuel streaming out of the wing, the aircraft was becoming dangerously lopsided. The pilots knew that when they eventually landed, they'd be 50 tons overweight, and their braking power would be compromised. They had no idea if they could even stop in time. The final decision. After more than an hour of troubleshooting, the crew finally had a plan. But now, they had to calculate if they could safely land the plane, given the extreme conditions. Could they stop on the runway? Would the aircraft even stay airborne? They used the onboard systems to calculate the landing distance. But there was another problem. The computer couldn't give them an answer. The aircraft was too damaged to calculate the safe landing distance. The unlikely landing. Finally, after carefully calculating every factor, the pilots took the risk and began their descent. With skill and precision, they lined up for an emergency landing at Singapore's Changi Airport. Against all odds, the crew brought the A380 down safely. 440 passengers, 29 crew members, all safe. They had faced the impossible and won. This incident highlighted not only the remarkable skill of the flight crew, but also the vulnerabilities hidden within even the most advanced aircraft. The Airbus A380 may be the largest and most sophisticated plane ever built, but on that day, it was put to the ultimate test. A dramatic view of a Qantas A380 flying in the sky, fading to a tense music cue. On a routine flight, a brand new Airbus A380 with nearly 500 souls on board was about to face a disaster unlike anything the crew had ever imagined. The cause? A catastrophic engine failure. But how did they manage to land this crippled giant safely? And why is the story considered one of the finest examples of airmanship in history? This is the story of Qantas Flight 32, a flight that could have ended in tragedy, but instead became a testament to extraordinary teamwork, quick thinking, and skill under pressure. The unthinkable starts to unfold as the A380 soared high above the Indonesian jungle. Something went terribly wrong. Engine number 2 exploded mid-flight, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spiral. Debris shot out from the engine, damaging vital systems across the plane. Fuel began to leak from the left wing, but the pilots weren't going to panic. Captain Richard D. Crespigny, an experienced veteran, and his crew quickly realized they had to improvise. With so many systems failing, they couldn't rely on the usual flight computers. They had to create their own solution. With each failure, the crew methodically eliminated one malfunction at a time, carefully calculating the plane's remaining capabilities. This process wasn't just technical, it required trust. Trust between the pilots, the flight crew, and the support staff back on the ground. Making critical decisions. Finally, the computer spit out an answer. They would need to land 35 knots faster than usual due to the loss of vital systems, including the leading edge slats. This increased their landing distance significantly, but it still gave them a slim chance to stop on the runway. The computer predicted that the plane would stop with just 130 meters to spare. Any misstep, one wrong move, and they'd risk overshooting the runway. And even with precise flying, the risk was still there. The computer's estimate was based on incomplete information. There was no way to know exactly how badly the plane had been damaged. Realizing the stakes, Captain D. Crespigny made a sobering call. He ordered the lead flight attendant to prepare the cabin for a possible runway overrun and evacuation. A plan to stay in control before committing to the landing. The pilots needed to check whether the plane was still controllable. They began testing the aircraft's handling by lowering the flaps and assessing how it responded in various configurations. Despite the aircraft being sluggish and difficult to maneuver, they found that it was still flyable, but barely. With engines 1 and 4 in a degraded state, and engine 2 shut down entirely, Captain D. Crespigny made a bold decision. Instead of adjusting all the engines, he chose to keep engines 1 and 4 at a steady power setting and use engine number 3, the only working engine, to control speed. The crew requested a 20-mile final approach to ensure they had enough time to line up with the runway. They were about to make a landing under conditions that could only be described as a miracle in the making. The landing, heart-stopping moment sauce. They neared Singapore's runway. The tension was palpable. The entire crew was on edge. Every decision mattered. For the passengers, this was a nerve-wracking wait, unsure if they would even make it to the ground safely. The A380 touched down fast, with the runway rushing up toward them. Captain D. Crespigny slammed on the brakes. At the same time, he deployed engine number 3 in reverse thrust, desperately trying to slow the aircraft down. As the plane barreled down the runway, the first officer shouted, "Use maximum braking." But Captain D. Crespigny responded calmly, "I am using maximum braking." The brakes were pushed to their absolute limits, and it wasn't until the aircraft had slowed to 60 knots that the crew knew they had made it. Just 150 meters from the runway's end. The next crisis: fuel, heat, and explosions. But the danger didn't end there. With the A380 now stationary, the aircraft was sitting on a runway drenched in fuel, and the brake temperature had soared to over 900 C. If the fuel ignited, they would face an explosion that could destroy everything. To make matters worse, engine number 1 was still running at full power, and despite their efforts, they couldn't shut it down. This was a ticking time bomb, with jet fuel spreading under the aircraft, just inches from the red-hot brakes. The decision was clear: evacuate the plane or wait for fire crews to handle the situation. The crew decided the safest course was to keep the passengers on board, where they were more protected from the immediate risk of fire. The final act. A close call for 13 agonizing minutes. The crew and fire services worked to prevent disaster. Finally, the decision was made to evacuate the passengers via air stairs. It took 20 more minutes for the emergency stairs to arrive, and the passengers were finally brought to safety. It would take 3 hours for fire crews to finally shut down engine number 1. But despite everything, not a single person was injured. In the aftermath, investigators discovered the root cause of the engine failure: a small crack in an oil pipe. Over time, this crack had worsened, leaking oil onto the turbine, which ignited during the flight. The resulting fire caused a disc in the turbine to burst, creating the uncontained engine failure. Thanks to this incident, all A380s with this engine type were inspected, and 53 engines were removed from service. A major safety improvement was made, and the A380 would go on to fly safely for millions of passengers. In an ironic twist, just days after the incident, Captain de Crespigny boarded another flight home to Sydney. The engine on that flight failed too, forcing another return to Singapore. But that's another story for another time. The story of Flight 32 will always be remembered as a near-miss, a testament to the skill and teamwork of the flight crew, who turned an unimaginable situation into a survival story. Thanks to their heroic efforts, all 469 lives on board were saved. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.